Good evening. On behalf of the Trinity Forum and the School of Public Policy of Pepperdine University and InterVarsity Press, I'd like to welcome you to this evening conversation with Andy Crouch. My name is Bob Freiling. I serve as publisher of InterVarsity Press and also publisher of Andy's new book, Strong and Weak, Embracing a Life of Love, Risk, and True Flourishing. And to put this book in the context of publishing, our purpose as a publishing house is to serve those in the university, in the church, the marketplace, and the broader culture with thoughtful books that help people engage with a meaningful Christian understanding of life and be able to live that out in periods of faith and trust and grace and truth. And Andy's book is a prime example of that kind of book, and we're very proud to have published him and this book that is available to you this evening. I've known Andy for more than 20 years, not only as a publisher, but as a colleague and as a friend. And I always enjoy listening to Andy speak and think. And unlike many, he tends to do both at the same time. But Andy, thank you for being with us this evening, and thank you for your long-term publishing partnership with InterVarsity Press. And speaking of partnership, I want to thank Cherie Harder and your colleagues at the Trinity Forum for your partnership with us. I think this is the 5th time in recent years that you have welcomed us to be a partner with one of these evening conversations, and it's always a joy to be with you and to be part of all of you who come to engage in these kinds of issues of faith. So thank you for your leadership, your concern for truth, and how you do so, and your team with an elegant grace. Very much appreciate that. And it's also my pleasure to introduce to you Pete Peterson, a sponsor of this evening. Pete is the interim dean of the School of Public Policy of Pepperdine University, and he is going to have a few more introductory comments before Andy speaks this evening. Pete?
Good evening. Good evening. I bring you greetings from the planet Malibu, or as I like to call it, the land of the big hands and real tans. I wanted to clear up a little bit of a confusion that I saw on social media. This is not a book launch event for a book, The Strong and the Weak, a Super Tuesday memoir by Donald Trump. I just wanted to make sure that that was clarified. But it is a pleasure to be back here in Washington, D.C. The School of Public Policy at Pepperdine, though based in Malibu, has increasing ties here to the nation's capital. We send a lot of students here. In fact, I know that we have some alums here in the audience. Some of you may know that the Trinity Forum offices at our fairly new building at 2011 Pennsylvania Avenue, and I'm excited to announce that this summer, the School of Public Policy will be launching its first 4-credit summer seminar course. We will be offering that in a night and weekend format this coming June, and I believe there were some flyers about that. If you have any questions about that, please feel free to come up to me afterwards. For reasons not quite clear to me, other than the building, I can't see any other reason to be here because it is 75 degrees in Malibu right now, and it feels like it's 75 below here today. But again, the relationship and the title of this speaker series that we started several years ago, The Moral Sense in Politics and Policy, is really a takeoff on one of Pepperdine School of Public Policy's founders, James Q. Wilson, who, as many of you know, wrote a groundbreaking book called The Moral Sense. And in many ways, what we try to do at the School of Public Policy is bring a unique liberal arts approach to what is often a professional, dare I say, technocratic advanced degree. And so relationships like this one with the Trinity Forum to think through not just the math of public policy, but to understand there really is a public in public policy, one that is situated in a particular place, in a particular time, with a particular history, and a particular relationship with God. That is something we understand uniquely at Pepperdine, and that's why nights like tonight are so important to us. So without further ado, I will bring up our great partner in this effort, Cherie Harder. Thank you, Cherie.
Well, many thanks for that very gracious introduction, Pete. I'll just add my own welcome to all of you to tonight's evening conversation with Andy Crouch on the strong and the weak. And as both Pete and Bob mentioned, this really is a partnership effort, and we've just been blessed with some fantastic partners. As Pete noted, this is part of an ongoing series on the moral sense in politics and policy. And over the last several years, we've heard from a variety of fascinating speakers on topics ranging from the strange persistence of guilt in a post-religious world to the friendship and the war experience between Lewis and Tolkien and how it affected their moral imagination, to injustice and how it's addressed, to power and how it's redeemed, and tonight we'll be looking at authority and vulnerability. So we're very grateful to our friends at the Pepperdine School of Public Policy, led by Pete Peterson there, and the chance to partner with them. And I also just want to say a word about our other partner, Bob Freiling at InterVarsity Press. It has been such an honor and a pleasure. And I want to mention him tonight in particular because Bob is actually going to be retiring in June of 2016. So this may be the last event that he is here in his official capacity. We certainly hope that he will be joining us in unofficial capacities with great regularity. But while Bob is a very humble and unassuming guy, there is an incredible amount of experience and expertise there. He's been at InterVarsity and InterVarsity Press, I think, combined for almost 50 years, at InterVarsity Press for the last almost 20, at a time when the publishing industry has been in great tumult and upheaval and has shown just extraordinary leadership, persistence, and real vision in leading it through it. So, Bob, we've just been grateful to work with you and hope we will see you continuously, whether in an official or unofficial capacity. And of course, we're also excited that each of you is here. We anticipate a fascinating conversation from Andy on a topic that is sure to be of interest in a town very focused on authority, perhaps not so much as vulnerability. So if you have friends who wanted to be here tonight but couldn't, we'll be recording tonight's evening conversation, and we'll make it available on video at our website at www.ttf.org. And you're also, of course, welcome to add your comments either on our Facebook page, where we'll be posting pictures, or on our Twitter feed at #Trinity Forum. If you are new here tonight or not familiar with the Trinity Forum, we work to provide a space and resources for leaders to engage life's greatest questions in the context of faith. And we do that by sponsoring readings and publications which draw upon classic works of literature that explore those enduring questions and connect the timeless wisdom of the humanities with timely issues of the day, as well as sponsoring programs such as this tonight, to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders and engaging those big questions of life and ultimately coming to better know the author of the answers. The great questions of the humanities relate in general to the purpose and the content of the good life, what it is and means, and how it's realized. And while it is commonly assumed, as well as frequently asserted, that the good life, or human flourishing, is primarily the result of growth of personal freedom, autonomy, and capacity, some form of self-actualization, our speaker tonight will offer a provocatively different argument, that human flourishing for both individuals and communities requires the growth of both authority and vulnerability, our capacity to act and meaningful risk, and that only when we are strong and weak are we able to best relate, to fully love, or to be fully human. It's a counterintuitive and fascinating argument, and there are few who can make it with the thoughtfulness, depth, or insight of our speaker tonight, Andy Crouch. Andy, in addition to being the author of Strong and Weak, is the author of Playing God, Redeeming the Gift of Power, as well as the book Culture Making, Recovering Our Creative Calling, which was named one of the books of the year by Christianity Today in 2008, as well as Publishers Weekly, Relevant, Outreach, and Leadership Journal magazine. It also received a shout-out from Lecrae in his 2014 hit Nonfiction, making Andy possibly our only speaker endorsed by the hip-hop industry. Andy also serves as executive editor of Christianity Today and has acted as the executive producer of CT's This Is Our City, a multi-year project featuring documentary video, reporting, and essays about Christians seeking the flourishing of their cities. And he serves on the governing boards of Fuller Seminary as well as the Equitas Group, a philanthropic organization focused on ending child exploitation in Haiti and Southeast Asia. He's also a senior fellow at the International Justice Mission, and his writing has appeared not only in his books, of course, but in Time Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and several editions of Best Christian Writing and Best Spiritual Writing. At the end of Andy's remarks, he and I will have a brief conversation, and then we'll turn it over to audience Q&A. Andy, welcome.
Well, thank you, Cherie. Thank you, Pete. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Bob, especially for publishing my books. That is something that's I've appreciated that. All the risk that you've taken and all the fun we've gotten to have together because of it. It's been really marvelous. And thank you to all of you for being here. I am excited for tonight. When my last book came out, Cherie and many here were able to be part of a conversation about it that really in many ways was my favorite conversation I had about my book, Playing God, anywhere I went. And I think one of the geniuses of the Trinity Forum is hosting substantial conversations. And I've sort of decided fans are really cheap, readers are a little less cheap, but great conversations are what I live for, and I'm anticipating that tonight. So I'm going to try to get started by giving you some of the themes of this new book that emerged from my book, Playing God, which was a kind of a bigger, thicker book about power. This book is smaller, simpler, shorter, and thus hopefully more people will actually read it than read the previous book. And it just explores one theme, but it happens to be this incredibly important theme, I think. I have a weakness for big topics, so my first book was about culture, which Terry Eagleton has said is the second most complicated word in the English language. My next book was about power, and this book, modestly, is simply about the human condition in all its fullness. So that's what I'm going to try to do. And here's how I want to frame the human condition. I will admit that in a moment of vulnerability, funny things are happening in front of me on my computer, which was supposed to show you something. Next, let's see what happens if I click. Ah, look at that. All right. The human condition is that we have far more than any other creature, two things that you might not think would go together, and I will not pull the speaker's trick of hiding them from you. I'll just give them to you both at once. We both have far more authority than any other creature, and we also have far more vulnerability than any other creature. This is the great, I don't know if it's the only great, it is one of the great mysteries of human life, is how you can have, as a species and as individuals, more authority and more vulnerability than any other creature we share this planet with. You can look at it simply ecologically. So think about authority as capacity for meaningful action. Should we use that phrase? That is, I'm not thinking in a restrictive sense about titles or positions or offices, which sometimes grant authority, but what those titles, positions, and offices grant is the capacity to meaningfully act in a certain scope of action. And if you just think ecologically, human beings are able to act on this planet that we have sort of come of age of and inhabit with far more scope than any other creature. Every other creature inhabits one ecological niche where it can act in a meaningful way. But we human beings have been able to fill the earth. We are in pleasant places like Malibu, but we are also in Washington, D.C., in less salubrious climates, and far more than that. I mean, so human beings are on the continent of Antarctica. Why? Not, in fact, for any reason other, as far as I know, really, than to just simply study the world, to learn more about the world we're in. The penguins are in Antarctica because that's the place it's good to be a penguin. And penguins actually would not thrive in Malibu, as hard as that is to believe. But human beings, who don't, in a sense, naturally thrive anywhere, you might say, there's not one climate that we're just perfectly suited to, are able in some way to thrive everywhere and able to meaningfully act everywhere we go. Very different from every other species. You can also look at this theologically. In the telling of the creation of human beings, the Genesis text says, God created them in his image, male and female God created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over all the other creatures. Human beings have this responsibility, we understand as Christians or as people of biblical faith, to have dominion for other creatures that those creatures do not have for us. So I look out the back window of our house, out at the lawn behind our house, and there are these squirrels that live in our backyard, and I have an interest in my squirrels. They aren't really my squirrels, but they're the squirrels in my neighborhood. And I watch them, I pay attention, I'm distracted by them. I'm not quite as bad as the dogs in the movie Up, squirrel. No. But I can easily absorb 10 or 15 minutes just watching the squirrels sort of scamper around my backyard. I notice the squirrels never take an interest in me, as near as I can tell. They don't seem to look at me. They don't say, wow, a human, look at that, human, oh, how cool. And I have a sense of concern for the squirrels in my backyard that they do not seem to have for me. I worry about when winter is coming. I watch them carrying the nuts in their mouth, and I think, what is the chances this squirrel is going to remember where that nut is, 4 or 5 months from now? Apparently they do remember. Amazing memory squirrels have. But I worry about my squirrels. My squirrels never look back at me and say, human, how is your retirement plan going? Are you saving? That's just not their job. But it is my job. It's this unilateral, asymmetric relationship of authority. Because I somehow, and I think you see it even more in human children than in grown-ups who get distracted by other things. You see even in human children, this sense of dominion, this sense of care, this sense of wanting to see the whole world flourish, because actually we would say that is why we are here in the world, for the flourishing of the world. More authority than any other creature. And at the same time, and this is the interesting twist, more vulnerability than any other creature. So other creatures are born, and they quickly have all the capacities they need to make their way in the world. A baby lamb is born, and almost right away, it's up and toddling about. Within a few months, it's weaned. It's sort of off to the races of being a sheep. Human beings are born, and for 8 months, 10 months, we can't even ambulate. We have to be carried around by other human beings for almost a year of life. And in no meaningful way are we ready to make our way in the world for years and years. In fact, I think this has now been renegotiated upward to about age 35. We are dependent. It's getting longer and longer. And of course, the reason it gets longer and longer is that human beings are so sociable, we're so embedded in society that we are profoundly dependent on one another and indeed on culture in a way that other creatures are not in the same way. But to be dependent is to be vulnerable. And vulnerability, let's think of it not just as emotional openness or emotional transparency, which can be a component of it, but think of it more broadly as exposure to meaningful risk. That when you are vulnerable, something that matters to you is very much at stake, could be lost. And this is the human condition, in no small part because we, in a way that other creatures don't seem to be, are aware of our mortality. We narrate our mortality. We anticipate our mortality. We mourn our mortality in ways that other creatures certainly do exhibit some awareness of this, but not in the way human beings do. And so we live within this horizon in which everything is at stake. And as full of life and flourishing as a room like this is, we know that 100 years from now, no one in this room, in all likelihood, will still be living. Everything that matters to us will be handed over to others. Whatever was unique to us, where will it be? And that is a question only human beings seem to dwell on. And that is the root of the vulnerability of the human story. And the biblical text reflects this as well. In an interesting way, in Genesis 3, it describes the man and the woman, the first human beings, the first image bearers, as naked, though without shame. And it occurred to me a few years ago that this is actually a word we only use of human beings, for the most part. It's really only human beings who can be naked. Or if you're in the South, naked, I believe is the... and I think naked and naked are both words in Southern English, and naked is just the bare descriptor, as it were, and naked is you're like up to something, being naked. But anyway, only human beings actually can be either one. And yes, people have pointed out to me there is the naked mole rat, so there is one other creature we call naked, so just take that as read. And there are the hairless cats that you can find on the internet. I recommend this. Don't go looking. You can never unsee this. But Dr. Evil has one in the Mike Myers movies. Those indeed are naked cats. They're the exception that proves the rule. Every other creature pretty much lives in the world. Even that baby lamb, the moment it's born, has pretty much everything it needs to survive in the world. And we human beings are partial. In our physical presentation to the world, we lack, and so all of us clothe ourselves. And having been to the nude beaches of Greece, I've discovered what a gift clothing is to 95% of the human race. It is actually very fortunate that we clothe ourselves, and in most places in the world, we have to just to physically survive. But of course, nakedness is not just physical vulnerability. It is the vulnerability of being known by others. It's social vulnerability. Only us. How can this be? That we both have more authority than any other creature, and we have more vulnerability than any other creature. People have noticed this. Blaise Pascal said, man is but a reed. How do you put it? Man is but a reed, the most feeble thing in nature, but he is a thinking reed. We have capacities for memory, reason, and skill that other reeds, other feeble things don't have. Churchill kind of doubled down on this and said, we are all worms, but I do believe that I am a glowworm. That's right. We're glowworms. There's something about us. And I want to push this a little further. I want to say, actually, these aren't just two things that mysteriously go together and make up what it is to be human, but actually that it is when you have authority and vulnerability together that you have this very popular word now, flourishing. What does flourishing consist in? I want to suggest it happens when you both have capacity for meaningful action and exposure to meaningful risk. Those two things together. Think of the time in your life, whenever it may have been, it may be right now, it could have been a long time ago, when you felt most alive, most fully engaged in something, some activity, some relationship, some community. And I bet you will find that at that moment, someone else was exercising authority and also opening themselves up to vulnerability. And in doing so, they were making it possible for you to have capacity for meaningful action. And there was something meaningful at stake. I think the high points of our lives are not our spectator moments. They're the moments when we're actually invested and at risk and also have the capacity to do something of significance. And the moments we linger on and remember and celebrate are those moments. This is, of course, what a healthy family is. In a healthy family, parents have a great deal of authority and use it. We've learned that permissive parenting, that is authority-less parenting, is not healthy for children or for parents. But parenting is also incredibly vulnerable, as you discover when you find yourself in the midst of it. And to the child, it can look like parents are pure authority. But from the parent's point of view, there's so much vulnerability. My wife and I came down here last night and stayed in Georgetown, and at 2 in the morning, she woke up. So our 18-year-old and our 15-year-old are at home alone. We make movies about this. And Catherine woke up and she said, I don't think we told them to lock the side door. Now, honestly, we live in one of the safest places on this planet. And my wife and I laid there awake for 20 minutes until finally I said, Catherine, you got to call our son's cell phone. And sure enough, the door was like totally unlocked. Anything could have happened. Oh, teenagers, you know. And that lump in your throat, in your heart, that's just part of the flourishing, actually, of caring for other human beings, not just in parenting, but in any meaningful relationship. This is what flourishing is, authority and vulnerability together. So this allows me to do something I love to do, which is to make a 2x2 chart. So that's why we have the slides this time. So you can put flourishing up and to the right, authority and vulnerability. If you're high in both, I think you are experiencing some measure of what you're meant to experience as a human being, and other people around you are too. When we live this way, it makes room for the kind of creative power that we got to talk about last time I was here. But there are other alternatives. So you could live with a great deal of vulnerability, but without authority. You could live with a tremendous exposure to risk, but minimal capacity for meaningful action. And I would call that suffering in its most broad sense. You could also call it poverty. I think that poverty, in many ways, much more deeply than it's about a lack of financial resources, minimally speaking, is really what it really is about, is being exposed to all the risk that we all bear as human beings in this risky, complicated world, but having no capacity to meaningfully act that would be commensurate with that risk. So that I, as a father in a very privileged part of the world, can worry about my child's, about the door being open and what might happen to my children. But I can call my son, he can lock the door, and I can go back to sleep almost entirely sure that my son and daughter are safe. And there are billions of parents tonight who have no lock, have no way to secure their children's future, do not know what's going to happen, even if they just have to go out through the slum to the latrine at night. And they have all the same vulnerability I have and no capacity to meaningfully act in that setting. And of all these four corners, this is actually the only place I know every human being has been, every grown human being. I think we've all tasted this in some way. There's been a moment in our lives when you were so exposed to risk and there was nothing you could do to change it. Even in a room as put together and powerful as this room. I know that's been true for you. It's been true for me. And it really is true for most of our neighbors on this planet. Now, you could move over to the left, and the interesting thing is the left is actually where we begin in a healthy human sequence of development. So that safety, we'll call it, which is very little capacity for action and very little exposure to meaningful risk, is what parents seek to provide for their children. That is, we try to minimize their risk, but we also limit their authority. And at the beginning of our lives, really, how meaningfully can we act? We haven't even found out that our hands and feet can, meet and hang out. So we can't offer words, so we can cry, and that isn't a meaningful action because others around us interpret that cry and respond. So there's a minimal beginning of authority, even in a 1-hour-old human infant. But what parents do, if they are able, if they live in conditions of flourishing, is they work to gradually increase the two together. And I think what happened here is the screen that tells me what my next slide is blank, even though you are seeing the slide. So I'm having a moment of vulnerability here because I don't know what my next slide is. But, it is what I wanted. What they do is they gradually increase both capacity for meaningful action and, in a commensurate way, exposure to meaningful risk. So now, yes, you can walk to kindergarten. That's a little bit of a risk. It's also a little bit of opportunity for authority. And you can dawdle and look at the squirrels on the way. And now, then 16, you can drive a car. Whoa, okay, that's authority and vulnerability. Off to college. And the sequence of human life, I think, is meant to be from safety to flourishing. It's meant to be from a beginning state of protection and minimal authority to, in a sense, an end state or a fullness of life, which is both high authority and high vulnerability. And it's interesting that the biblical picture of the human story begins in a garden, which is a protected environment. But it's not meant to stay there. Be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Don't stay in the garden. We're meant to fill the earth. What can happen, though, is that we can get part of the way along this path, maybe a long ways along this path, and then decide, actually, maybe we'd like to return to that corner. There is something appealing about the fantasy of going back to that kind of infantile state where I don't have a lot of responsibility and I don't have a lot of risk. And one of the fantasies this takes, I believe, yes, there's the next slide, is a cruise. So I am not part of the cruising part of humanity. This is not my own fantasy, but I have friends who love cruises. And what they say is the delight of a cruise is it's down and to the left. There's really nothing you have to do, just watch the ocean go by. But really, there's very little vulnerability, assuming it's an ordinary cruise. Now, if the engines give out and you have to spell out help with your bodies on the upper deck, then you're vulnerable. But let's assume it's a good, happy Caribbean cruise. Really, how much capacity for meaningful action do you have on these boats? I mean, I don't even think they have internet on them, or it's very expensive at least. And you can't pilot the boat, and it's not your job. Just relax. For 3 days, heaven. For 3 years, it would be hell. It would be hell for 3 years. For a lifetime, and yet, in certain conditions of a certain kind of affluence and power, some people do and can choose just to opt out. You can actually experience tremendous flourishing at one stage of your life, reap tremendous rewards, and then if you choose, you can move into a gated community, live off the safe investments, if you can find those, that will just generate a sort of steady stream of income, and never again really have to act, and never really have to risk. I was in a gated community in Colorado Springs that was actually, there were 2 gated communities. So you went through the first gated community, but then there was another gate. And within that was the gated community that kept out the riffraff in the outer gated community. And I went to the country club there for lunch with some friends, surrounded by people who in every way had achieved what our culture often dreams of, and had been able to cash it out in the form of access to this place. And as I looked around the lunch room that day, I felt as if I were surrounded by ghosts. They lacked expression. Their conversations lacked life. You could tell they had made every possible choice in their life, at this stage at least, probably not originally, to return down and to the left, and what I was surrounded by was not so much safety as withdrawing. I was in, Sharia mentioned briefly in the introduction my connection to the nation of Haiti, and I was there in May and presented a version of these quadrants. And we got to this lower left corner, and I was with young Haitian church leaders. And I said, well, what would it be to have no authority and no vulnerability? And the room kind of broke into laughter, and they said, no, there's no such thing. Like, I mean, you walk out your door in Haiti and you have vulnerability. Well, there's no one gets to live down there, right? And I said, well, actually, in the United States, you can. You can choose to withdraw. This leads to the last corner, the most interesting corner. It's the corner where you would have authority without vulnerability, capacity to act, but no or little exposure to meaningful risk. This sounds promising. And I would say it's the dream of controlling the world. Because what control is a system in which you can act with complete confidence of what the outcome will be. That is, there's no slippage, there's no meaningful risk when you act in a controlled system. A machine works this way. The machine always gives you the same output. And the dream of control is that there's a way to find myself up and to the left, have the capacity to do the things I want to do in the world, but not expose myself to the risk that I fear. The problem is, it looks like I'm going to show, I'm not going to show you those slides. So I'm going to skip over both the beautiful cocktail and the solo cup. I don't have time to do these, so I'm going to skip them, except to say addictions are a form of control. Addictions start out with the desire to be up and to the left, but the interesting thing is it doesn't work, actually. And so what moving up and to the left really requires, if you want to try to stay there, is not just control, but exploitation. Because the world is not set up to actually deliver the results that we seek when we seek control. And thus, if you're going to get those results, you're going to have to use violence. Sometimes it's camouflage violence. Other times it's very overt violence. But all life up and to the left is actually purchased at the price of someone else having to live down and to the right. Which is to say, all quests for control end up offloading vulnerability. I think there's a kind of law of conservation of vulnerability in the cosmos. Human life is vulnerable. So if you're going to get rid of vulnerability, someone else is going to have to bear it. And this means that there's this line from exploiting to suffering that is now the dominant human story. Because what another name for up and to the left, by the way, is injustice. Injustice is a social situation where a few human beings get to have tremendous scope for action with very little risk, very insulated, very protected, at the expense and in the face of the reality of most other people in that system being utterly exposed to risk and unable to act. So the story that was meant to go from safety to flourishing, that human story is it's all too rare, let's say. And the common story now is this oscillation between exploiting and suffering, sustained by violence. So here's where we are. We barely have flourishing in our world. In some ways, I don't think you've ever really met a flourishing human being. All of us have ended up on the exploiting, suffering continuum, and a few of us can withdraw altogether. And flourishing is fleeting and hard to find. So much for the slides. I want to take a few minutes, about 6 more minutes, I hope, and talk about what this means for leadership. Because I loved your phrase, Cherie, leading thinkers with thinking leaders. I don't know if I fit in either of those categories, but I'll try to pretend. And I do think it's worth considering how does leadership affect and participate in these systems? So, a couple thoughts. Let's think about unhealthy leaders. It seems to me there's 2 basic ways to be a leader who reinforces the exploiting unto suffering axis. One is to be an authoritarian leader, and the other is to be a manipulative leader. And if you're a really powerful unhealthy leader, you manage to be both. Here's how it works. Authoritarian leaders promise to their communities that they can have control. They can have capacity for action without risk. And by the way, every human community at some level wants their leaders to tell them, we can have this. And an authoritarian leader says, if you hand me sufficient resources of coercion and domination, I will be able to sort of gather you under my wings, and we together will be able to live up and to the left. Authoritarian leaders flaunt their unaccountable power. I am not making reference at this point to any particular person in American public life. That's one mechanism, and at various times and places, it's rewarded. Authoritarian leadership is rewarded. It's certainly being rewarded right now in many nations around the world. Leaders who flaunt their authority without vulnerability. But the other way to get that control is to flaunt your vulnerability. You can flaunt your authority as an authoritarian leader. I may have misspoken a moment ago, but you can flaunt your vulnerability as a manipulative leader. And what manipulative leaders do is that they spin out narratives of their own victimhood or the victimhood of the people they represent that exaggerate and kind of completely blow out of proportion their own vulnerability by way of attracting a certain kind of sympathy, a certain kind of identification. But it's not real risk. It's manufactured vulnerability, and it's used to gain control. One of the reasons that I'm trying to reframe vulnerability away from just meaning emotional openness is that actually emotional openness is a fantastic way to manipulate people. So if we think of vulnerability only as those moments when we are kind of emotionally transparent, sometimes that can be very truly a meaningful risk. But there are people, and I worry sometimes that I could become one of these people. I sometimes, who knows, maybe it could happen tonight, at moments of tenderness, I can sort of tear up in the presence of a big crowd. And I've been in the presence of speakers who are really good at that sort of moment of emotion, and something catches in their throat, and you sort of feel this human sympathy. Now, on the one hand, that could be genuine vulnerability, but wow, is it a source of power for a speaker. And I think the test is, if someone only is ever emotionally open when they're in control, as I am when I'm on stage, but they're not emotionally open with their family, who could speak back, who could interact. They're not emotionally open with their peers one-on-one. They only have those moments of emotion when they are actually able to transmute that into additional authority. That's a sign of a manipulative leader. It's one of the most powerful ways to manipulate. So no one talks more about their vulnerabilities than dictators. Dictators love to talk about their enemies. I mean, back when Hugo Chavez was still alive and lecturing for hours on end, what was the theme of his lectures? His own authoritarian strength and the incredible ill will of the United States. When the truth is, if only the United States cared about Venezuela, like 1/8 as much as Hugo Chavez made it sound like, right? But dictators need enemies. They need to be able to assert their vulnerability. And this really gets to the best unhealthy leaders manage to leverage both of these at once, and to be authoritarian and a victim at once. And why not go there? This is the genius of Donald Trump, is he manages to both harness resentment and grievance and the sense that the world is unfair, and also project this incredible persona of macho domination. And it's very powerful, because what our human communities are looking for is someone who will take us to the left. Someone who will tell us we don't have to be as vulnerable as we fear we have to be, that we're not as vulnerable as we know we are, when in fact the truth would be that to be a human community, to be a human being, is to experience risk. And healthy leaders help their communities bear risk. How do we do that as healthy leaders? 2 thoughts on this. First, healthy leaders bear hidden vulnerability. Healthy leaders bear hidden vulnerability, and I think this is the drama of leadership, actually. Every morning, as I understand it, the President of the United States receives from the Director of National Intelligence usually something called the President's Daily Brief. And this is a summary of everything that the intelligence services of the United States have learned in the previous 24 hours about the threats to the United States. Most highly classified document in the US government. Only one page has ever been released to the public since it began in the 1960s, and it's the page from August 4th, I think, or early August 2001. One page, one item, briefing item that said, Bin Laden determined to strike in US. Every morning, the president gets this comprehensive account of the vulnerabilities the nation faces. And for the rest of the day, the president cannot tell anyone. The president goes out to ceremonial occasions, to negotiations, to all the business of the day, and can't tell anyone things that if we heard even just one page of that brief any given day, all of our hair would stand on end and we'd start running around like chickens with our heads cut off. And it's actually essential that the president not disclose and somehow find a way to bear that, because if the president were, if he were, currently if he were to disclose it, it would cause such upheaval in our community that the meaningful action we could take today would be disrupted. Think about what would happen if that were all in the morning news every day. We would completely lose our capacity for meaningful action. And anyway, most of us have no authority that could be commensurate with those vulnerabilities. To disclose that would simply be to unload on the American public things that we have no way to bear anyway. I have a friend who's on a much smaller scale, a leader. He's the president of a little startup company, 30 employees, second round of venture funding. And he said, I've learned in my fundraising in Silicon Valley that there is only one answer to the question, so how's business going? He said, it's one word long. It's great. The only thing you can ever say is great. It doesn't matter if you are about to run out of money. It doesn't matter if you lost your biggest client. It doesn't matter if somebody just poached your chief of sales. you've got to answer great, because if you answer honestly, it will disrupt that sort of, well, veneer or just presentation of possibility that's part of entrepreneurial leadership. And so he has to bear all the complexity of leading this firm that actually has been quite successful, but hasn't been quite enough successful to achieve escape velocity. And if he went out to his employees every morning and disclosed all that, it would disrupt all of their lives. It would actually rob them of proper authority, saddle them with vulnerability they have no means to handle. The drama of leadership is, how do you live with people seeing you as authority without the vulnerability that you actually know you have? Do you see why this is so tricky? That's up and to the left. The truth is, in my 30 minutes with you, it's now 33 minutes, that's one of my vulnerabilities, but I'm almost done, almost ready for the conversation. In this time with you, what you have been almost exclusively conscious of, except at a few moments, is whatever authority I may have. This whole setting of a speech like this, Cherie's very gracious introduction and others, is all set up to give me capacity for meaningful action, and we all hope that I use it in some way. What probably has not occurred to you, should not occur to you, cannot fully occur to you, is all the vulnerability and risk I bring to this moment, even though I bring a lot. I have this running narrative in my head as I speak. Why didn't they laugh at that? Why did they laugh at that? Am I going too long? People are rustling. I think they're getting distracted. And I've got this constant narrative of, that's my own assessment of my risks. You all know this. You all experience this. And then I have far deeper things. I have that moment, in my marriage this past week where I still regret, that I'm trying to work my way back from. I have the much longer history of failures, of broken promises. I think, what would it be like if someone came up and gave an honest introduction to me, rather than all the little, surfing across the high points of my life? Andy Crouch has authored 3 books. Well, Andy Crouch turned in his first 2 books years late out of procrastination, cowardice, and spiritual warfare. No one ever says that. Andy is married to Catherine. They have 2 children and live in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. No one ever talks about the 3 girlfriends who completely appropriately broke up with me earlier in my life, right? But that's all me. And except in moments like this, I can't and shouldn't share it, partly because if I were to disclose all my vulnerabilities, it would freak you out. And it would distract us from what I'm here to do in this moment, because actually, to the extent I'm exercising leadership here, I'm here to help you flourish. And that means I need to attend to your vulnerabilities, not my own. And so I have to find a way to, in a healthy way, hold my vulnerability, not become the up and to the left controlling idol, and yet be present to you in the authority and vulnerability God might have for you. The drama of leadership is, how do you do that in a healthy way? I'll just say, you won't do it without friends. One more thing. The other thing leaders have to do sometimes is descend to the dead. Ronald Heifetz is a theorist of leadership whom I greatly admire, and he says the first job of every leader is to avoid assassination. And I get his point. An assassinated leader is not much good, not much use. And he says, look, you gotta sort of modulate the anxiety in the system you lead so that people don't just eject you. I get that. But then I think about the example of Jesus, and I think we need to modify Heifetz's dictum and say the job of the leader is not to entirely avoid assassination. Actually, I have a word for someone who devotes all their energy to avoiding assassination. That's a dictator. The job of a leader is to prepare for the right time and place where their assassination will be of redemptive value as much as possible. And this, of course, is what Jesus did. And the truly transformative leaders in our world are ready, at least, to go to their own cross. I was with some staffers today at lunch, and one of them said one of the things she greatly admired about one of her former members that she worked for is that he would say regularly, if I lose the next election, who cares? What does it matter? Let's do the right thing. That, in a way, is saying, in the frame of an elected official, I'm willing to lay down all my authority. If you are not ready to lay down all your authority at the right time, you are probably secretly a controlling, idolatrous leader. And Jesus did this. And his death broke the power, it broke the power of the most powerful lie in the human story, which is that you need authority without vulnerability. It's not true. Christians could be the most free people in history because we are the ones free of this lie that says, well, we're mortal, we're going to die, do everything you can to avoid that. No, even on the other side of death is life, which means we are free to sacrifice ourselves in ways that could break the power of that cycle of exploiting and suffering and restore the human story to flourishing. Thank you all so much for your time and attention and for the forthcoming conversation. Thank you.
Well, thank you for that, Andy. That was terrific. This is a DC audience, so it's likely that many people have last night's events on their mind, the results of Super Tuesday. And when you look at your quadrant, what seemed to happen last night is the most authoritarian candidate drew the most votes from the most vulnerable population.
Yes.
What is going on?
Yeah. I think when you are stuck, and in a way, by definition, when you're down and to the right in that quadrant called suffering, it is an experience of being stuck. Because if you weren't stuck, you could act. But when you feel stuck, and clearly there's a lot of people who feel trapped in vulnerability, I think it's actually very hard to believe the safety to flourishing story. Because it's the like 90-degree opposite of your story and your reality. And so very often, and I think we see this through history, and we see it in our own lives in ways. I mean, you know, there are respectable versions of this. I don't know if Donald Trump is respectable, but there are respectable versions of feeling trapped and turning to someone or something that promises you an exploitative or indeed violent way out. So violence goes both ways along that axis. It is initiated, I would say, by the powerful who are seeking to grasp from the world what the world is not designed to give them, which is authority without vulnerability. But then the poor, you could say, or those who are disempowered in a system, then have a kind of corresponding violent response that seeks to grab and gain from the world what the world is clearly not giving them. And so the desire to turn to someone who promises, if you embrace my authoritarian way, we'll all come up to this corner, is very, very powerful. And I don't think we should be, I sense in some of the commentary about it, and even in my own instincts about it, a kind of condescension. But you have to understand how degrading it is to a human being to feel like there is no way for me to have the authority I was made for, and also to have the meaningful risk that we kind of know we're made for. So I see some of those dynamics at work.
Moving on to one of the other quadrants, the withdrawal quadrant. You mentioned there that it's difficult to do that now, except for, say, gated communities and cruises. But it does seem like one fairly easy and incredibly widespread way of withdrawing is by avoiding actual reality with virtual reality.
Yes.
And in fact, all of the time use surveys show that that Americans in general, young Americans in particular, which doesn't necessarily bode well for the future, is spending more and more time in virtual reality. And what tends to be crowded out are things like reading, socializing in person, sleeping, and the like.
Yeah, sleeping, especially. Who needs that?
You know, if in fact we are societally withdrawing, what does that mean for flourishing in the future?
Oh, man. Oh, yes. And you are so right about this. And I wish I had kept in my presentation this stunning picture from this past week, or was it the week before, of Mark Zuckerberg at this virtual reality conference. I hope you saw it. Google, if not now, but later, Google Mark Zuckerberg virtual reality, and you will see a picture of Mark Zuckerberg striding down an auditorium aisle, and there's a whole auditorium full of, I will just say, men, largely of size, with these goggles on them. They're sort of in these comfy seats with virtual reality goggles, and he's the only human being who is upright, who's able to move, who's able to act, and they are all plugged into this virtual reality. And here's the power of it, is that virtual reality gives you a simulation of being up and to the right. So this is the power of video games. This is why video games are a bigger business than Hollywood, 93 billion versus 80 billion. Because video games let you feel like you have capacity for meaningful action, and there's a certain kind of risk in the game. That's part of the game. But it's all attenuated. So the path to mastery is shallower than in real life. So you can become a good quarterback in Madden football way faster than you actually can become a good quarterback, right? So very shallow path to mastery, but very shallow deliverances of skill, and very shallow actual risk. I mean, there's really not much at stake. But the simulations are getting better and better. And so we get to experience this vicarious, or I don't know if vicarious is the right, but a virtual sense that I'm living that flourishing human life I was made for, but I'm actually in my parents' basement. And it's tremendously dangerous. And again, it's easy to caricature that, and maybe a lot of us in this room don't spend a lot of time on video games, but there are other virtual versions of real human life that are incredibly seductive. I think I write about this in the book. There are two ways of using social media. And one is as ersatz activism that allows privileged people to engage in a kind of simulation of actual engagement with issues. Pick your issue. There's another way that is actually potentially very powerful, and we saw it, for example, in Hong Kong last year in the democracy demonstrations there, which is where people who are literally down in that suffering quadrant use social media not just to have this virtual experience, but they actually use it to leverage embodied risk of protest. That happened in the Arab Spring, obviously with mixed results, but it happened in the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against practices of policing, that when a vulnerable community uses it to leverage their ability to actually have capacity for meaningful action, that's really good. But when people with privilege and power use it, it's just a beautiful simulation that doesn't cost me anything at all.
You mentioned perception. It seems like there might be one other problem as well, which is not only is it quite easy for people to have the mirage of flourishing or authority through social media, but I think there's also a human tendency shared widely to feel acutely our own vulnerability and perhaps take for granted some of our authority. So if people are trying to perceive rightly, how can they do this when it seems to war against human nature itself?
This is this amazing, well-documented phenomenon called loss aversion that is just beyond a doubt a reality that people fear loss more than they desire gain. And I see that mapping onto these quadrants, that authority is the capacity to gain, because when you use your authority well in the world, good things happen in the world. But vulnerability is your risk of loss. And consistently in experiments, it's shown, and we can see it mapped onto real life, that there's we really are made for both, but we are so much more motivated to avoid vulnerability than we are to seek authority. So your question, I think, is how do we recalibrate so that I'm not over-indexing on my vulnerability and thus drifting to the left? And I think overwhelmingly, when people get power, what they use it to do, the first thing they do is they buy insulation from risk. And that's not right. That's not where real life is. So at a personal level, I think my friends who know me well can help with that. They can help. It's amazing how often when you disclose some sense of risk, other people who know you well can just diffuse it. It's like mist, it dispels, as they say, oh, you're worried about that? Don't be worried about that. Like, it's not that big a deal. And I think about some of the things I've had to work myself up to sharing with friends feel like my deepest vulnerabilities and distort my choices. And then just saying it and having my friends say, I guess that's an issue, but it's not that big a deal. Look, let's reframe it. Just frees you. So I think that can happen. I do think for those of us who live in environments of privilege and power, there's something very important about apprenticing ourselves to people who have never been able to live with the level of insulation we do. I spent this week in Haiti in May. I've been there a couple times now, and I just find it's like this detox from my calibration of what I think the world is. That's a horrible mixed metaphor, sorry. But anyway, it's this detoxing of the privilege I experience and re-indexing of how much authority I have, much more than I give myself credit for. I'm responsible for much more. And how much vulnerability I have. I actually need to be working on my vulnerability if I'm going to move up and to the right.
And how does one work on their vulnerability?
I would start with prayer. And so many mornings, now that I've kind of arrived at this language, in the morning I will in prayer say to God, my maker and redeemer, what is the meaningful action you have for me today? And what's the meaningful risk you have for me today? And my goal is to go through my day looking for meaningful risk. And I have yet to have a day when I sincerely prayed that I didn't find some meaningful risk. It's there. It's just that we avoid it. As a speaker, for example, I have the option of moving up and to the left because I speak about these issues over and over. And so I do reuse some material. There's a couple jokes I've used before, and they still work, and it's awesome, right? But I got really scared a couple years ago. I thought, am I going to become one of these people who just always gives the same talk and always kind of works, but it's never fresh? And I went to a friend of mine who's a Broadway actor, and I said, now you have to say the exact same lines every night, and you can't change the lines, but how do you keep it fresh? He said, my rule is I take a risk every night. And I've realized I need to do that. I need to come into every engagement with any group of people and ask, what's the risk I'm taking here I've never taken before? And if I don't have an answer to that, I'm in danger of going up and to the left. Because I have plenty of authority, but my challenge is, how do I take a risk today? So that's my way, and I think all of us could be doing that. And then other people can help you with that.
Let's talk about institutions. I know your book focuses mostly on individuals,
Yeah.
but does the quadrant still hold for institutions? And if so, how can one make a case to the leader of an organization, or say the leader of a nonprofit, we've both been leaders of nonprofits, that it is actually in the best interest of the flourishing of the organization to maximize vulnerability?
Yes, take that to your next board meeting. We're going to be maximizing vulnerability this quarter, folks. Well, the difference, I think it absolutely applies to institutions, and I think the only difference is they have an even stronger bias to the left than individuals do. And that is because the reason we build institutions is to preserve things that matter to us. And we often do not want to put at risk those things that we're preserving. And so institutions get weighed down with our need to have stable systems, and this is a genuine human need, by the way, to have stable systems that we can trust will be there often beyond even our own lives. The problem is that can lead to them becoming absolutely agents of idolatry and injustice, which are two names for that upper left quadrant, or equally often safety and withdrawal. And again, I think of institutions that at the founding of the Republic, I think of some of these clubs that some of us have access to, that at the founding of the Republic were actually, I mean, in some cases, literally where revolution was hatched, you know, in these drinking clubs or social clubs or whatever. But then over time, they become this unbelievably restrained place where elites can sort of retreat from the world and be with one another. And that institution that started out perhaps serving a real function of flourishing and risk and collective action becomes just this retreat into privilege. And that's a risk for every institution, a huge risk for churches. Many pastors, when I present this, say, what my people want is for me to tell them church is the place where they can be safe. It's the place we can withdraw from the world. So the trick is not to go to your board and say, let's maximize vulnerability this year. It's to do both at the same time. Because health is not just, let's take bunches of risks. It's let's match our risk with our capacity for meaningful action. So my friend who leads that startup, his job is not to take risks that can't match things the company can actually pull off. It's to take the right risks that actually increase our authority and put us out in new markets, new opportunities. And if you do that, I think that's when institutions actually can continue to flourish. But every generation of leaders has to pull the institution away from its bias towards safety. I think that is a reality of institutional leadership.
We're going to turn it over to audience questions in just a second, but as everyone's thinking of their question, one of the things that really struck me and even surprised me, at the very end of your book, you conclude the book by talking about laughter as both the culmination and the combination of authority and vulnerability. What makes it so, and why is it so integral to flourishing in your quadrant, in your paradigm?
So I ultimately think the way we're going to be rescued from this exploiting suffering axis that realistically all of us live on a lot of the time, the way that's going to happen is not by ourselves. It's really not actually going to be a self-improvement project. It's a rescue project. And it's grace. Any flourishing that we've had in our lives, any true risk, any true authority has been grace. And when you are surprised by a good thing, I think one of the things you do is you laugh. You're just like, oh my goodness, I cannot believe that just happened. Every once in a while, I mean, the most extreme example of this sort, it's a very minor thing, but I remember showing up in the Frankfurt airport to get on a flight to India that I was supposed to be in, seat 78J or something. And for no reason I have ever been able to discern, the guy at the check-in counter tore up my boarding pass, handed me a new one, and it was seat 2F, which was first class on Lufthansa for the 12-hour flight to Delhi. And then the pilot comes on as we're all sitting there, and I've had to choose between, Krug and Dom, and, which one am I going to drink? And the pilot says in his German accent, "I'm so sorry, we have a short delay. We will be delayed by about 30 minutes. I was like, delay the flight as long as you want. And what did I do? When I was handed this first class boarding pass, I had done nothing to deserve. I laughed. I was like, oh my goodness. Well, that's salvation, okay, right? You thought you had one thing coming, you got a totally different thing. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, then were we like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad indeed. Laughter is the voice, the unforced, free, and also in another way, uncontrollable voice of the rescued and redeemed, and that's where we're going.
Excellent. Time for audience questions, which is always one of the most dynamic times. Those of you who have been here before know, you probably know this by heart, there are 3 simple rules to question time. Keep it brief, keep it civil, and keep your question in the form of a question. So both Drew and Ben should be coming around with microphones. Please wait for the microphone to get to you after you've been called on, and give your brief civil question. So right here on the second row.
When does charging into vulnerability turn into a lack of self-respect, do you think?
Wow. When does the appropriate embrace of vulnerability turn into a kind of masochism, you might say? Is that part of it? A sort of a self degradation rather than rather than flourishing. Am I?
When does it turn to a martyr complex?
Martyr complex. Yeah. Wow. Do I have to have answers to these questions?
It's always helpful.
Well, I think, here's what I think it is. So vulnerability is exposure to meaningful risk. And I do choose that adjective. That adjective is important. It's not just any old risk. There's lots of risks I can take that really are not meaningful. And then the question becomes, well, where does meaning come from? Well, meaning ultimately, I would say, comes from participation in a true story. The way we get meaning in human lives is through participation in a story. There's a past, a present, and a future in which I'm taking a part. It seems to me that this martyr complex or masochism that kind of pursues pain for the sake of pain has lost track of the meaningful story. Now, sometimes I would say, by the way, it actually becomes part of one of these manipulative stories. It's a way of gaining sympathy. It's a way of gaining a certain kind of control over others. But there may be other forms of it as well, I would think. There are probably many paths to that. But I would say what they've all lost is they've lost track of the true story, which is up and to the right toward flourishing, not toward suffering. Yes, there is a call to descend to the dead, but the early church had this real problem that people were trying to become martyrs, and the early church had to say, no, this is a matter for spiritual discernment. You don't go out and try to make yourself a martyr, and the community has to validate a call to that kind of radical self-giving, including eventually the forms of it in monasticism and celibacy. This is not something that you just sort of take on your own and go out and do. You join a community that holds that call and that keeps even very radical forms of self-giving in the context of a story that is about communal flourishing. Without that, I think it can be quite dangerous. Yeah.
And let's see, right there, Drew, sort of a third or fourth row.
If your quadrant applies to institutions, what are some of the implications for the church?
Well, the church is, unfortunately, I don't know, the church is a very broad thing, of course, many different congregations, many different streams. It does seem that in a way, you could say the church, at best, best case scenario, tends to be quite drawn to the safety quadrant, and actually at worst becomes profoundly exploitative. And the Oscar-winning movie this year, Spotlight, is about a whole stream of Christianity that tolerated and abetted the most extreme possible examples of exploiting and suffering. And this is because the church can mobilize kind of religious rationales for its flight from vulnerability that other institutions can't. So it's awesome if you can exploit in the name of God. Like, that's the best possible rationale and rationalization you can give. So I think those of us who have some kind of leadership in the church, whether ordained or not, have to really ask, what is the meaningful risk to which Christ is calling his people, which has got to be way more than the North American church has ever imagined embracing. And then, how do I lead people in that direction without getting assassinated? That is, without getting fired from my position. And that means you have to titrate risk. You have to gradually introduce people. Scott Cormode at Fuller Seminary says, effective leadership in the church involves failing people's expectations at a rate they can stand. So their expectation is, I'm going to be comforted, I'm going to be safe, I'm going to be preserved. The reality is, it's going to be suffering. Take up your cross, follow Jesus into risk. But effective leaders do that at a rate people can stand. And so I think that's part of it, is that very nuanced, careful assessment. What can they bear next? What can we bear next as a community? The other thing I would say is the thing we can do as leaders in the church is we can introduce people to the saints. And the saints are the people who have lived totally up and to the right. They operate with incredible authority, spiritual authority, and they are totally open to risk. And when you actually meet one, it can transform your life in a day, in an hour. And so part of my job as a journalist, a Christian journalist, is to introduce the church to people you may never have heard of who have a transforming perspective on life. And I think the part of any leader in any church is there's some in your congregation often, but if they're not there, bring them in. Bring people to them. Go on pilgrimages. A pilgrimage is basically a trip taken to encounter holiness that you can't find in your own place. And let's go meet those people. They are there in the world. I can introduce you to some in Haiti, I can tell you that, but all around the world and in our own country and just down the road from us, there are people who live with astonishing authority and vulnerability. Go meet them, and it will make a difference in your church community.
Right here, front row. No.
Thank you. So, there you go. So I've been trying to kind of mesh what you've been saying, and it kind of builds on that question a little bit with what you were saying in culture making. And I want to frame this by saying I don't want to paint this question in culture war, us versus them, because I think that's unhelpful. Yeah. But how do we as Christian leaders engage in a society that has a very pervasive and alluring postmodern narrative? So how do we kind of run counter to that, and what does the authority and vulnerability look like there, even in non-overtly theological situations, just faithful biblical presence?
Yes. One of our sources of meaningful risk in this moment is that we are facing a very powerful counter-narrative that tells a different story. Ultimately, at its root, it is Nietzschean, and it actually is an exploiting and suffering story, though it is camouflaged, I think, very well. And it pushes against our story. So what do? Well, the most important thing is, I mean, this was the mantra of, I think, the Christian leader who most saw this in the 20th century, saw it most acutely, the blessed Pope John Paul II. And the mantra of his, do popes have mantras? Probably not. The watchword of his papacy was, be not afraid. So the most important thing is not to be afraid. And this, by the way, is what the angelic messengers of God to his people say every time they show up. Partly, I think it's because when an angel shows up, the first thing you're like, whoa, I don't want that. But the first thing they say is, don't be afraid. Because when you're afraid, you no longer are thinking in terms of meaningful risk. You're just thinking in terms of self-protection. And we cannot get backed into self-protection. And we need not. What can the devil take? Don't fear the one who can only take your body. And then the second thing is to attend to the cracks in that story through which the light still shines. Charles Taylor, the philosopher who wrote A Secular Age, a book which I cannot pretend to have read. I've attempted to read it many times, like the former vice presidential candidate who said he tried to read Plato's Symposium every year, which I don't think it meant what they heard. But yes, I've tried to read A Secular Age often. But what I did get from it is this phrase, cross-pressure. So he doesn't use it in the sense primarily the cross, though that's in the background. But what he means is there's this grain of thought in our world that is this kind of modern, postmodern narrative you refer to. But there are these experiences that break into it, into the most secular life. There are these cross-pressures from outside the secular frame, the immanent frame that he calls it, that complicate the human attempt to live along the grain of that narrative. Our job as Christians in this secular age is to watch for the moments when there are these cross-pressures that open up these fissures in the plausibility of that narrative, and they're all around, they're in every human life, they're in every community's life, and step into that with creative offerings that rather than browbeating people or lecturing people, just surface. What does it feel like to realize, I don't think my story can account for this? There's this other piece. Maybe I can give one example. I admire my wife so much because she'll speak up in contexts where I would never think to. And years ago now, we were at a lecture at Harvard by the translator of Jacques Derrida, the great postmodern philosopher and literary critic and so forth. And his English translator was a professor of English at Harvard, if I remember correctly. And she gave a lecture that we went to. And it was a profoundly cynical lecture and it dealt a lot with gender, and it was just deeply cynical about the potential for any reconciliation between men who have abused their power and women who have been victims, in a sense. That's not quite an adequate rendering of the lecture, but that was the underlying theme. And that's what I say about there's this cynicism, and ultimately it is this suffering, exploiting story. And along the way, this lecturer made very dismissive references to Christianity, made a very kind of tasteless joke about the Virgin Mary, just was dismissive in every way of the Christian story. In the Q&A period, like we're having now, my wife raised her hand and asked the lecturer, she said, is there anything that gives you hope for relations between women and men, given the completely broken system that you've sketched? And the woman who was lecturing paused for a while, and she said, I think we have to learn to forgive one another. Okay, so you just were like dissing the Virgin Mary and giving all these slurs against Christians, but when asked to offer hope, you turn to a moral vocabulary, the only source of which in human history is the biblical story. Now, let those who have ears to hear. Did that lecturer see that? Realize what she'd said? Did she see the inconsistency? I don't know. But I know that my wife opened up at that moment this little crack that for those who had ears to hear, oh, there must be something else. Look for those moments. Those moments are totally there in the most secular place.
Great, we're going to take 2 more. We'll take David over there.
Okay. Andy, thanks so much. When you opened up tonight, I thought about G.K. Chesterton's orthodoxy
Yes.
and the 2 basic drives of humankind is for adventure and for security.
Ah.
And I thought, well, maybe you're going to take that. So I wanted to know how you'd fit that into the quadrant. Because those gated communities you talk about, they got all the security,
Right.
no adventure.
Yes.
The hippie on the West Coast surfing all day has got great adventure and no security. And I think Chesterton's argument then is only through our faith do we actually bring those together.
Yes.
And final, a personal comment. For 4 years in the White House, I worked on the President's Daily Brief. And your description tonight was very, very pertinent and very, very interesting. The first time I ever saw it from that angle. So thank you.
Thank you. It's a great question. Yes, if there is not some fundamental safety in the world. So you notice I changed the name of that quadrant in the end. It's withdrawing in its toxic form. But there is a healthy reality of that. That if it is not the case that somehow our lives are held, that there is meaning ultimately, I mean, what's the ultimate source of safety is that there's some meaningful telos to this whole thing. There's some meaningful beginning and some meaningful end. This is one of the problems with our postmodern story. It has no meaningful beginning and no meaningful end. We're just stuck in the middle with each other. We do require that. I would just say it's grounded in something outside ourselves. It's ultimately grounded in the cross, in which the one who was all authority embraced all vulnerability, emptied himself of authority, went to the land of the dead, and has returned bearing the good news that death is not the last word and that life triumphs over death and that there's life beyond death. And Heifetz talks about the job of a leader is to create a safe space. This might be my paraphrase, but I think it's accurate, is to create a safe space for a community to do necessary suffering. The job of a leader is to create what he calls a holding environment where people feel safe enough to actually take an adventure, which inevitably will involve risk. And it occurred to me the other day that what the cross does, it makes, if I can put it this way, it makes the cosmos a holding environment. It makes the whole world now is safe. This language of safe spaces has now, I think, become a little debased, but there's a real need for that for human beings. The cross of Jesus and the subsequent resurrection of Jesus of the dead has said this entire world is held by God, who will recreate anything in it, will rescue and recreate anything in it that was ever meaningful. And thus, nothing, in one sense, nothing is ultimately lost. And thus, everything can be put at risk. And so there's an asymmetry there. If we go on a quest for safety, I think we'll lose, well, it's interesting. Someone said, those who seek to save their lives will lose them. But those who lose their life will save it. It's been saved. It's in the passive. It's not something I don't have to go save myself. It's been saved. And now I can actively lose, and I'm still saved.
Last question, front row here.
So mine's on a slightly different track, but as you're talking about, moving to the different quadrants, I'm thinking about from a science aspect, we have people who are actively researching cures for cancer to try and end suffering, but we also have people who are talking about genetic modification of embryos, selective abortion, that kind of thing to kind of prevent human suffering from people who would be born in the world with various deformities. So where do you see those, because that seems like a lot of shades of gray, where does that kind of start delineating for you in this quadrant?
Wow, thank you.
That's the one I know.
No, there's a question there. That's beautiful. That's I'm so grateful that you would bring that up. Ultimately, it seems to me that the deep question here is, what is meaningful risk? And clearly, much suffering is absurd. It's meaningless. I lost my best friend to cancer 3 years ago, age 42, 4 kids under the age of 8. And that cancer per se, it would be, I believe, an insult to God to say there was meaning in it. And I celebrate the scientists and physicians and all the people who extended his life for 15 months beyond what it might have been, and who seek to end that. So there's something right about it. The problem is, this shades into another quest, which is the quest to end vulnerability and to not die. And to not be mortal. And the Christian and biblical, Jewish and Christian teaching is that we are not immortal, we're mortal. Now, we had access to the tree of life that in relationship with God sustained life, but we are not intrinsically immortal. We are part of a perishable creation, and in some way, God's glory can fully dwell in that. And the problem with some of what's happening with our technologies of life is that they are being applied to a story that says it will never be good enough until we've removed all risk of mortality. And where that leads us, I think, is up and to the left. And what's missing is an account of human frailty that would say there is actually authority even in frailty. There's capacity for meaningful action even when you are not full of health and youth. And I saw this in my friend David, who did die. But as many people discovered, David was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer at age 42. I'm not sure I have that age right. Maybe it's 44, in his 40s. He lived for 18 more months. Many people discovered this. It was by far the most flourishing 18 months of his life. Because suddenly, under the horizon of mortality, choices change, other people change, an unbelievable community gathered around this family and is around them still. I experienced conversations with my friend I've never had with any other human being of the most profound flourishing of my life. And I had the privilege, along with a few friends, of being there in the last days when he was down to nothing and looked like an 80-year-old man, could not get out of bed, and yet there was flourishing in that room as powerful as any I've ever known, and the presence of God was in that room as powerfully as anywhere I've ever been, and was there at his grave as well. A world that doesn't have that hope and doesn't know that God, all it knows to do is try to control the conditions of life. And the problem is, we will end up exploiting the vulnerable to do it. To the extent of creating vulnerable human beings whose only purpose in the world is to have organs harvested and material harvested to address the suffering of the powerful. And it's not going to work. And B, it's going to demand more and more of us, and it's going to sacrifice more and more of the powerless. And it's never going to lead to the flourishing that we seek. And wow, is this a place where we need people to live into those cross pressures and offer a different story and tell the story of those who live with disability, those who live with mortality, and discover there's flourishing in our suffering. If we don't tell that story, it's going to be exploiting. But maybe we can tell a different story and use all that we've been given in a different way. That's what I'd hope.
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you all very much. Thank you.
We hate to draw it to a close. I know there were several of you with your hand up that didn't get your question answered. Andy will be here right afterwards. We'll be selling his book, Strong and Weak. Andy will be out there to sign it, so there'll be a chance to buy one, to ask your question to Andy in person. We always run out of time. It's just the hazard of the job. In addition to the opportunity to buy Andy's book, I also just wanted to draw your attention to a small invitation on each of your chairs to join the Trinity Forum Society. As many of you know, the Trinity Forum Society is a community of like-minded people who help make events like this possible and support the programs and the mission of the Trinity Forum. It's been not only our mission, but really our joy to provide programs like this that provide a civil, warmly hospitable, intellectually challenging and faith-based forum at a time when so much of our culture is marked by divisiveness, triviality, and distraction. It's a pleasure to be able to do it, and we're able to do it through your membership. Of course, there are also benefits attached with that. If you do join the Trinity Forum Society, you do receive our quarterly readings, which we have for sale out there. And as a special incentive to do so tonight, if you join for the first time, we will give you a free copy of Andy's book, Strong and Weak. What more can one want? In addition, just want to let you know about future evening conversations. Our next evening conversation at the Trinity Forum will be with Dana Gioia, a poet, the former chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts, recently named Poet Laureate of California, in this very room to discuss poetry and beauty in a fallen world. And of course, this fall, we'll again be partnering with Pepperdine to do yet another one of our series on the moral sense in politics and policy. So stay tuned for that. We'll certainly let you know about that once it's scheduled. Finally, as always, it's appropriate to end with thanks, and certainly there are many people to whom thanks are owed. Again, we just really thank our partners in this, Pete and Pepperdine. Thank you so much. It's always a joy. Bob and InterVarsity Press, it's great to have you both here and be with us for the evening. I'd also just like to thank my excellent colleagues who do all the work behind the scenes to make this possible. Margaret Eberly, who is our Events and Membership Director and is really the mastermind behind our event planning. Colleen Armali, our Director of Advancement and Development. Alyssa Abraham, our Office Manager, and of course our fantastic interns, Britta Friesen, Dan Struble, and Drew Masterton. Thank you so much. I deserve that. We've also been helped out this evening by former intern Carrie Lucas, who came back to volunteer, and by Zach Miller, who always does just a fantastic job with photography. So thank you to all of you to make this evening possible. Finally, again, thank you, Andy, for those fantastic and insightful remarks. Thanks to each of you for coming, and good night.